Well, here we are for another lesson in the Gospel of John. We'll look this time at John chapter 20, verses 19 through 31. As always, I hope everybody is doing well and continuing to weather this isolation and stay at home order that we're under. As I am recording this, it is, of course, Wednesday, and it is my understanding that the governor is going to describe in some kind of conference today what will happen once the order is lifted. If I'm not mistaken, the stay-at-home order goes until tomorrow, but after that, it's not clear exactly what will be allowed. So I want everybody to start thinking about what our next step will be as a church. Of course, first thing we need to think about is when we will resume meeting together. And then, of course, we'll have to talk about the conditions under which we can do that. And all of this, of course, will have to be under the guidelines of what the state says must happen. So I bid you to pay attention to the news in the next day or so. Let's get on the GroupMe app and discuss what our future plans are. And it would be good if we could set a kind of tentative return date within, the next few days or next week or so. So keep that in mind. And for now, we'll go to John chapter 20, and we'll look at the latter part of this chapter, verses 18 through 31. You may remember that as we left off last time in chapter 20, that Jesus had been raised from the dead, and that he had come out of his tomb that was in the garden. And we've mentioned in the last couple lessons that the fact that there was a garden there is theologically significant, that it is an echo of the Garden of Eden, that here we have the new world, the new life, the new creation beginning with the story of the resurrection of Jesus. And then we noticed how Mary went and told Peter and the other disciple, who may likely be John, how they saw with their own eyes that the tomb was empty, just the grave clothes were there. And then finally we noted that Jesus was seen by Mary Magdalene. At the end of that story, Jesus told Mary to go and tell my brothers that I am ascending, or I am going to my Father. And so in verse 18, Mary Magdalene came, announcing to the disciples, saying, I have seen the Lord. And she reported the things that Jesus had said to her. So what happens next? Well, we are told in verse 19 that it is the first day of the week, the same day that Jesus had seen Mary early in the morning. Verse 1, it was the first day of the week when Mary Magdalene came early to the tomb. And now it is evening on that day, John tells us. So it's still the same day, that day of Jesus' resurrection, but now the day is coming to a close. Of course, you remember that not only here in John's gospel, but in the other gospels as well, the disciples never seem to know when they're going to see Jesus again, that he appears without any kind of warning, basically. There is no schedule that is set for them to see Jesus. And that certainly is the picture here. We are told in verse 19 that the disciples are there still on this first day of the week. And again, this first day of the week is another part of this new creation kind of idea, because it takes God 6 days to create the old heavens and the old earth. And so here we have the beginning of a new week, the first day of the week, the first day in which there is life eternal celebrated in the resurrection of Jesus. And so we're told here that the disciples are together. But exactly what is their situation? We know from verse 18 that Mary had reported what she had been told to the disciples, but we are not told what the disciples' reaction to her report was. Did they get the import of that message? Did they understand what it meant? Some have suggested that even if the disciples did believe Mary's report, that in John's telling of the story, there is really nothing here that would have led them to expect that they were going to see Jesus anytime soon. As a matter of fact, what Jesus told Mary to say was, "Tell them that I am ascending to my Father." And some have suggested that the disciples may have not even expected to see Jesus ever again, that they may have thought that, well, he's gone, he's on his way, he's leaving, and we'll not see him again. Of course, we have to realize that there is much more to this story than John is telling us. And if we look at the other Gospels, we see this. In Mark 16 and verse 11, it says, "When they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her," that is, by Mary, "they refused to believe it." And then in Luke's Gospel, these words, the words that they had seen Jesus, appeared to them as nonsense, and they would not believe them. We have to realize that this must have been an especially confusing day for the disciples. At first, as the Gospels say here, they didn't believe what they had been told. Jesus is alive? No, no. And you can just imagine how the story would have gone. Mary saying that I thought it was the gardener, and then I realized it was Jesus. It's certainly understandable that some of the disciples would have said, "Well, Mary, maybe you just did see the gardener. Maybe you're just thinking it's Jesus." It would have been completely natural for these men to be skeptical. We also have to realize that they were afraid. We're told here in verse 19 that they were in a place with the doors shut for fear of the Jews. So they are afraid of being arrested as accomplices of Jesus. They are probably thinking that now that they've had their way with Jesus, they might come after us as well. And so fear is ruling their minds. They are also emotionally disoriented, a disorientation that started all the way back at the Last Supper, but has only gotten worse over the last couple of days. And they must have been horribly confused. Now, they were kind of confused a lot of the time anyway, when Jesus would say that if you've seen the Father, you've seen me, or I'm going away and you cannot come where I am going, but I will come and you will see me again. We saw at the Last Supper that the disciples said, "We have no idea what you're talking about." And so we have to cut the disciples a little bit of slack here. It's very easy for us to look at these men and say, "Oh, they should have believed, they should have had faith in what Jesus had told them." But remember, as we noted last time, that in John's telling of the story, we don't have these explicit predictions of the resurrection. That John wants us to see another side of this, that there is a part of these men that even if they had been told, did not see the big picture yet. And so we have to be, I think, a little bit sympathetic toward these men and their situation. It says here that, of course, in verse 19, that they were in a place with the doors shut. Your version may say that the doors were locked. And the Greek word here can mean either one, to be shut or locked. It just simply means that the situation was secured. The door wasn't open. Now, whether it was locked, from the inside, that's not exactly clear from the wording of this text. But it does say that Jesus came and stood in their midst. I think it's somewhat unfortunate that a lot of speculation has arisen over whether or not this is a miraculous appearance of Jesus. In other words, is this a picture where the room is locked up and miraculously Jesus kind of materializes or appears in front of them? Is this a miraculous entering into a locked room? Or does it simply mean that Jesus came in? In other words, that he came through the door, that he opened the door, came in, and stood in their midst. We have to admit that the text does not say that this was a miracle. And for that reason, I personally am a little bit reluctant to say that this is a miraculous kind of appearance, especially when we have the situation here when the wording of the text does not necessarily mean that the door was locked from the inside. The picture is not that the door was locked and the room was secured, sealed shut. The picture is that the disciples did not want to be seen. They were indoors with the door shut. And the emphasis in the text is not how Jesus got into the room. That could have been miraculous, but maybe not. But the emphasis is rather on the fact that Jesus comes. That's the point, that Jesus comes to them. And he says to them, "Peace be with you," or "peace to you." This, of course, is kind of a standard Jewish Hebrew greeting. It's the kind of thing that people would say that had not seen each other for a little while, or maybe even could say as a kind of farewell. It was a typical greeting among Jews in the ancient world. However, as we have noted in the Gospel of John repeatedly, the words of Jesus often mean much more than they seem. And this is probably not just a hello on the part of Jesus here. I think it means, in this context, much more than that. When a Jew said peace to you to another Jew, the word peace, the Hebrew word shalom, does not just mean, absence of war, as we would think in an American context. It means something like wholeness, well-being. Peace to you means everything is okay. And that's the idea that Jesus conveys here. But of course, everything is okay in this situation, and that is significant. That here these men are afraid. They're confused. Emotionally, they're kind of on edge. They haven't yet believed what they have been told. And now Jesus stands in their midst and says, "It's okay." As if to say, "I am here, and everything that you've been told, and all your fears and your worries, everything is okay." There's a lot that we could notice about this particular word in the Bible. A lot has been studied about it. In the Old Testament, peace often has the sense of being in a condition of rest because God has rescued somebody from a dangerous or difficult situation, or because he has defeated their enemies. In a Roman context in which Jesus and his disciples lived, peace can also mean the idea of conquest, because peace is what happens after a war has been won, that the enemy has been vanquished and there is no more fighting. There is now peace because the enemy has been abated. And all of that, I think, is kind of part of what Jesus is saying to them in this particular context. Now that Jesus is alive from the dead and raised up, never to die again, surely in a way that had never been true before, now it is true to say everything is now okay. That God's people have now been rescued, that Jesus' removal from the realm of death means that there is rescue from death that is now possible, that those who join themselves to Jesus can be rescued from sin and death with him, that the last enemy, death itself, has been dealt the death blow. Now, did the disciples understand all of that at this moment? Surely not. But in typical fashion, I think, for the fourth gospel, we're hearing words here that are pregnant with meaning, that have a much fuller sense than they do just standing all on their own. And of course, the Apostle Paul speaks frequently in his writings too of the fact that now that Jesus has done his work, that we have peace with God. Remember in Romans 5 and verse 1, being justified by faith, we now have peace with God. And Paul talks about the peace that has resulted as the result of the work of Jesus in Colossians 1 and verse 20. So all of this, I think, can fairly be included in Jesus' statement here because of the context, because this is a post-resurrection context. We're then told in verse 20 that when he had said this, he showed them both his hands and his side. And the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. And so Jesus offered them physical proof that it really was him. Notice this is a little bit different from what we saw in the story with Mary. In the story with Mary, Mary looked at Jesus and didn't recognize him. And it's when Jesus spoke to them or to her that she recognized Jesus. Here, it is almost the opposite, that Jesus has spoken to them, but they don't quite have the sense of who it is. It is when they see the physical marks on Jesus' body that they come to understand. So, why this difference? Well, the answer to that might not be completely known to us, but I do think there are some advantages that Jesus may have had in mind as he gives these special evidences to these men. First of all, these men needed to be believers. There are going to be lots and lots of other people after this who will not believe that Jesus is raised from the dead. But these men need to believe it. And so Jesus offers them absolute convincing proof of who he is. And not only do these men need to be believers, they are going to be witnesses. This is what their job is going to become, as we're going to read here in the next verse or two, to go out and tell other people what they know to be the truth, the fact that Jesus was killed and then raised from the dead. That, in essence, is the gospel, as Paul recounts it in 1 Corinthians 15. And so these men need this special kind of assurance, and I think that may be why Jesus gives it to them here. And then immediately Jesus says to them that as the Father has sent me, I also send you. So first he repeats this statement, peace to you, but this time it is now a preface to this announcement that they are going to go out into the world, just like Jesus has said to them time and time before. Back in the Gospel of John and some other places, for example, in chapter 13 and verse 16, Jesus said that nor is the one who is sent greater than the one who sent him, implying there that they would be sent like Jesus had been sent into the world. In verse 20, whoever receives who I send receives me, again hinting that these disciples would be sent as well. In John chapter 15 and verse 16, Jesus said, I appointed you that you would go. And then he goes out from there in verses 18 and following and talks about how the world is going to treat them. And again, the idea is that they will be sent out into the world, and this is what they would expect when that happens. And then going down to verse 33 of chapter, see, is it 1633? See if I got the right verse in my notes here. In the world you have tribulation. And so again, this idea that they will be in the world. So the time for their going into the world begins. Now that doesn't mean that afternoon or that evening they went out preaching. there's still a few more things that have to happen before that can be accomplished. But Jesus is now simply announcing that starting now, this is going to be the time in your life in which you will be on your mission. That this is going to be what your job is from this point onward. A new chapter in your life begins today, as it were. That this is the day in which you began to be people going out into the world. And then it says in verse 22, when he had said this, he breathed on them. That is, he exhaled on them and said to them, receive the Holy Spirit. There's a subtle play on words here. The Greek word pneuma can mean breath. It can also mean something like wind. It's the idea of air that is in motion. And so your breath is air that is in motion. But it's also the Greek word for spirit. And so as Jesus puts his breath upon them, in Greek, the word for breath and spirit could be the same thing. And so Jesus says this symbolizes now the Spirit. If we read this text too literally, we might have a bit of a problem because we all know that in Acts chapter 2, the Spirit descends upon the disciples. And so somebody might say, well, did they get it in Acts 2 or did they get it here in John 20? Did they get part of it here and part of it later? I don't think that we need to read it that literally, that this is a symbolic action on Jesus' part. And this doesn't mean that they received the Holy Spirit right at that moment. It doesn't mean that now they are inspired, now they understand everything and know everything and so forth. I think it is best seen as a symbolic action of what is going to happen, that from now on, you are going to be men of the Spirit. And that Spirit is going to come upon them in about 50 days from now. But that is basically the picture that Jesus is painting. That from now on, this is what you men look like. Men of the Spirit who are in the world preaching this gospel, even though technically that has not actually begun yet. And so Jesus says in verse 23 that if you forgive the sins of any, their sins have been forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they have been retained. This sounds an awful lot like the statement that Jesus makes in Matthew chapter 18, the familiar passage to us there, that whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. Here we have in John chapter 20, and let's see, this is verse 23. If you forgive the sins of any, their sins have been forgiven, or that is, have already been forgiven. Very similar to the wording of Matthew 18. And I think the best way to understand what Jesus is saying here is not to get wrapped up in, the apostles now have the authority to forgive sins on earth, or, some kind of mistaken picture of what Jesus has now authorized them to do. Rather, Jesus is painting a picture of them working as agents of himself and God. Because as we hear in the other Gospels, only God can forgive sins. And Jesus, of course, claims to be able to do that. And so when Jesus tells these men that you're going to be doing that work, it simply means that they will be his agents, that he will be working through them. And of course, I think we can understand how all of this would be accomplished. First of all, we have to keep this in the context of verse 22, that they will be doing this work as inspired men. The Spirit will be guiding and leading them. Jesus promised this to them back in John 16, that the Spirit of truth will come and guide you into all truth and bring to your remembrance. And, all of this is going to be part of their work as Spirit-filled men. But we also heard in John chapter 16 that the Spirit would come and convict the world concerning righteousness and judgment and truth. And so, working with the Spirit in them, these men will be doing that kind of work as they preach the message about Jesus and as they encounter reactions to that message, that they will be telling people what their status is based on that reaction, and that would be a function of the work of the Spirit that was going to be in them. Well, all of this happened, and we're told in verses 24 and 25 that Thomas was not there. Thomas, one of the 12 called Didymus, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples were saying to him, "We've seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the imprint of the nails, and put my finger into the place of the nails, and put my hand in his side, I will not believe." Thomas's case is interesting. And of course, he is famously known throughout history as Doubting Thomas. And Thomas gets kind of a bad rap for not believing what his fellow disciples have told him. And I do suppose there is a little room for criticism there, that the men that he has been around for the last couple of years have told him something and he doesn't believe it. Maybe he should have. But there are a couple positive things that kind of come out of this. First of all, Thomas is not gullible. And I think that's an important trait, that the disciples were not gullible, and Thomas is kind of a model of all of them here, that he just didn't believe whatever he was told, especially what he was told about Jesus. Jesus had been part of his life. He had an experience with Jesus over the last couple years. And as much as he had heard Jesus speak, Thomas was still the kind of man that things needed to make sense to him. And even if these other men are saying we've seen Jesus, Thomas says, well, I'm not going to believe it until I see it for myself. Of course, people in the ancient world did believe in ghosts. Some people did. And it may be that Thomas thought that maybe they saw a ghost. Maybe they didn't really see Jesus. And Thomas is simply saying, I'm going to need proof. Now, certainly, these other disciples would have said, listen, we saw his hands, we saw his side. But Thomas says, I need to see it for myself. Really, if you think about it, his disbelief is really no worse than the disbelief of the others. We noted a moment ago that the others were confused and afraid and according to the other Gospels, not believing the things that they had been told initially. Thomas is really no different from them. And so if we're going to criticize and castigate Thomas, really the blame should be spread upon all of these men. No, I think what we have here is that Thomas is just like the rest of them, that he's acting exactly the way that they had acted. And as some have suggested, I think it's correct that Thomas is really a kind of representative of them all. That he goes from not believing this to really believing it. And the story of how that happens is very important. So we are told in verse 26 that after 8 days, that his disciples were again inside. The implication seems to be very clearly that none of them had seen Jesus again during this time, but now Thomas is with them. And Jesus repeats the experience exactly the same as it was in verse 19 and 20. He comes into the room, whether miraculously or not, the text doesn't say, but he comes into the room. He stands in their midst. He says the same words, peace be to you. And then just like in verse 20, where he showed the other disciples his hands and his side, so he says to Thomas, "Reach here with your finger and see my hands. Reach here with your hand and fit it into my side. And do not be unbelieving, but believing." What's kind of interesting is that he speaks as if he had heard exactly what Thomas had said. That's kind of an interesting little piece of this, how Jesus knows exactly what to say to Thomas. But the point is that he gets the exact same experience as all the others had. And Thomas comes to the conclusion immediately, verse 28, "My Lord and my God." This, of course, is the climactic confession in this gospel. And we need to realize just how important this statement is in the telling of the story of Jesus. Because we've seen over and over in this gospel that Jesus has worked many signs. He has worked the 7 signs that John has reported in this gospel. And yet over and over and over again, we are told that people did not believe. For example, you remember in John chapter 12 and around verse 36 here, that Jesus had spoken all of these things. This is that last public episode in Jesus' life. And in verse 37, though he had performed so many signs before them, yet they were not believing. And so Jesus had performed many signs in front of many people, and yet they did not generate faith in a lot of people. And we've seen glimmers of this. Remember the centurion or the nobleman's son in John chapter 3 there, or the Samaritan woman. But here, we've heard Mary's words before at the tomb of Lazarus, but here is kind of the climax. My Lord and my God. This is the conclusion that all of these signs are supposed to come to. And there is an echo here, perhaps, of an Old Testament text, Hosea chapter 2 and verse 23. God here is speaking about the Messianic age and how those will come in that day to say, "You are my Lord, my God." Does Thomas have that text in mind? I personally doubt it. But whether he does or not, his words are confirmation of what God said would happen. That this is the time when Jesus is recognized for who he is. And that has come clearly to the case of Thomas here. Notice specifically also that he calls Jesus my God. And this is kind of the focus to which everything in the gospel has been leading. We're going to see that here in verses 30 and 31, where John makes that very point, that you're supposed to come to the conclusion that Jesus is the Son of God because of all of these things. Thomas's initial skepticism and unbelief really makes him the ideal confessor if you think about it. He's kind of similar to Saul of Tarsus. He's not wanting to believe. He's not gullible, but he comes to his belief because he has seen with his own eyes Jesus, the risen Lord. This matches what we heard at the very beginning of the gospel, and so therefore kind of forms a frame around the telling of the story. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. And of course, that Word is Jesus. In John chapter 1 and in verse 18, we heard those famous words that the only begotten God who is in the bosom of the Father has explained God. He is the only begotten God. He is God in the flesh. And that is exactly how this gospel, therefore, kind of comes to its summary with Thomas recognizing this and saying it. And again, I think he's a representative of all of the disciples, that what happens to Thomas is really what happened to all of them. And that leads us then to some interesting statements. In verse 29, Jesus says, "Because you have seen me, have you believed?" Those words can also be read as a statement. In other words, because you have seen me, you have believed. And then Jesus goes on to say, "Blessed are they who did not see and still believed." Very often, I think it is read as if it were some kind of rebuke of Thomas. That, oh, Thomas, it would have been better if you had believed what you had been told and not had to have seen. Although I do think that that might not be entirely correct. Like the other disciples, Thomas needed to see. He needed to be a witness of this. And he needed to be a believer, and Jesus wants him to be a believer. I don't think it is necessary for us to take these words of Jesus in verse 29 as a rebuke of Thomas. Now, we do remember that there are statements in the gospel where people saw signs and believed, and yet we noted that their faith really wasn't very strong. And we've noted throughout our study of this gospel that the kind of faith that relies on miracles comes to be a faith that wants miracles and not genuine itself. And so while you could perhaps make the case that believing on the basis of hearing is the purest kind of faith, I don't think that Jesus is necessarily telling Thomas that his faith is inferior here, that it would have been better if Thomas had just believed. I think all we can get really fairly from this context is simply that Jesus is saying that, yes, Thomas, you do believe, you've seen, you've come to the right conclusion, but this is not something that can only be possible for people like yourself, for people who have seen, because it is possible also to believe and to be joyous, that is, to be blessed, even if you haven't seen. And that brings us, therefore, to this famous point that we have here as this summary. There are a couple of questions that some have raised about this text. John says in verse 30, "Many other signs Jesus performed in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book." So is John talking about other signs during the ministry of Jesus? We know, for example, from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus performed all kinds of other miracles. Casting out demons, for example, is never mentioned in the Gospel of John, but there are many stories of that in the other Gospels. So are these other signs in the ministry of Jesus? Or is John talking about Jesus showed them other signs of his resurrection, other post-resurrection signs, other proofs, as it were, that he really was alive from the dead? In Acts chapter 1, in verse 3, Luke tells us that Jesus presented himself alive to his disciples after his suffering by many convincing proofs. And so some scholars have suggested that that's what John is talking about here, that there were other demonstrations of the reality of the resurrection. Maybe ultimately we don't have to decide between these two options, because both would have produced the kind of faith that John is talking about here. I think a little bit more significant question has to do with the statement in verse 31, that these signs have been recorded so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. The question has often been raised, and I think fairly, just exactly what scenario is John talking about here? Is he talking about bringing unbelievers to faith that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God? Or is he talking about increasing the faith of believers? Is he thinking more along the lines of people like Thomas, who are already familiar with the story of Jesus and who maybe have yet to come to the fullness of conviction that they need? I'll let you decide, obviously, what you think is the point here. For what it's worth, at least for this afternoon, I think that second option is certainly worth considering. We've been told, and we noted in chapter 12 and verse 37, for example, that Jesus performed many signs that people witnessed with their own eyes, and yet they did not believe. And so I'm not sure that this verse necessarily means that if somebody will read this gospel, they will become a believer. They might not become a believer any more than the people who actually saw the miracles with their own eyes. But we have noted, first of all, in this context, the story of Thomas, one who knows the story of Jesus, but who needs to come to full faith. And we've also noted that John is telling this story of Jesus not for people who know nothing about Jesus, but for people who are already familiar with it. John has over and over again assumed that we know certain things, that we know who Peter is when he is introduced, or that we know certain other things, for example, about the burial of Jesus, or even in the text that we're looking at today, that we know that Jesus was crucified with nails driven into his hands and feet and so forth, which John never explicitly mentions. So I think you could make a good argument that John is writing here not to unbelievers, but to Christians who needed a fuller and stronger faith, and who, like Thomas, needed to come all the way. And there I think we might pause and think about maybe an application of this to our lives. I think you'll know what I mean when I say that Jesus is not just looking for followers, he's looking for believers. Thomas had been a follower of Jesus. You remember back in chapter 11 and verse 16, after Jesus said, "No, we're going to go to my friend Lazarus. We're going to go wake him out of sleep." And the disciples said, "No, Jesus, we shouldn't go back there. The Jews tried to kill you the last time we were there. Let's not go." And when it was clear that Jesus was going to go, remember Thomas said, "Well, let's go, guys. I guess we'll all get killed. Let's go and die with him." But he wasn't very happy about it. Thomas was a follower, but he had not yet become a believer. And here in John 20, he becomes a real believer. It is when he fully embraces that Jesus is God in the flesh that he becomes what he needs to be. And I would suggest that that is exactly what it is for you and I. That Jesus doesn't want us just to be followers. He wants us to be believers. And we, like these men, have to wrestle with and come to understand the implications and the importance of believing that Jesus is the Son of God. Because if he really is the Son of God, then everything that he said is the absolute truth. And there is no other truth than his, because his truth is God's truth. And so that's just one example of what comes from believing that Jesus is the Son of God. And if we believe that he has been raised from the dead, and our faith is in him who has conquered sin and death, and that we join ourselves to him because we believe he is God, the Son of God, that makes all the difference in the world. That is what Jesus is looking for. John says that This was written so that you might believe, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Of course, this is something we've heard throughout the gospel already. In John chapter 3, verses 15 and 16, whoever believes in him will have life, because God so loved the world that whoever believes in him should have eternal life. Again in chapter 6 and in verse 47, he who believes has eternal life. And in 1 John chapter 5 and in verse 13, these things I have written to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, so that you may come to know that you have eternal life. Being alive means believing in Jesus. That is simply the way that it works. We will never pass out of life into death, out of death into life. I'll get it right here in a minute. We'll never pass out of death into life. We will never become truly born again. We will not enter into the new creation and become new people unless we believe, like Thomas did, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. We'll pick up our study with John chapter 21 next time. There are just a few matters of unfinished business before this story can end, and John chapter 21 will show us the resolution of those matters. I hope everyone is well and stays well. Remember what I said at the beginning of the video, that we need to be thinking about the time after the governor makes the announcement as to when we can start getting back together. So let's discuss that in the next few days. Peace from God be with you all.